Okay, let's talk code names. I guess if it isn't obvious from the term codename, a codename is a name you give to a project or potentially a feature that is not the final name of the product. Something that you can use internally to refer to the product and then replace with the final name when you reach that point. Why would you even want a code name? Well, for things that are built on brand new IP or are big departures from what has come before in a franchise, a code name potentially predates the possibility of a name. If you have a project on a new IP, you might not even know what your setting is going to look like. You might just know that you're making a fantasy shooter, but you don't know that, in fact, it's going to be populated with elves. Maybe it's going to be populated with cat people or lizard folk or 6-foot-tall squirrels. You don't know yet. So putting a name on your product before you've even written a single line on a piece of paper is completely unrealistic. So in that case, a code name allows you to have a name for your project that you're working on, that people are spending time on, while still giving yourself the ability to figure out what you're actually doing. Because once you put a name to something, it starts to narrow your funnel. Once you call your game Quest for the Throne, then you've checked a bunch of checkboxes that maybe you didn't really want to check because you hadn't figured it out yet. And for sequels, this still applies. By calling yourself Dragon Age 3 right out the gate, you are constraining what you are potentially going to be. You're closing down the possibility space in a way that in the early days you may not want to do. So why even have anything at all? Well, if you have more than one project on the go, you need some way to refer to the different projects. If you are a larger organization, you need something to put into the finance system. You can't just have question mark, because even that won't work if you have more than one thing on the go, and it's just going to become a confusing mess. So you need some sort of name or term or phrase or something to apply to your projects. Additionally, once you give a project a name that could ship, it has a high possibility of shipping. This is particularly important in the case of sequels. Once you call your game Dragon Age 3, there's a pretty good chance that it's actually going to be Dragon Age 3. And maybe you actually don't want it to be called Dragon Age 3. Maybe you want to go back and use a subtitle. So you use a code name to prevent that momentum of naming from occurring. By calling it something else, something that isn't really shippable, you allow, again, the project to figure out what it is and allow you to come up with a name that makes more sense for the project. What are some characteristics you should be looking for in a code name? I think there are really only 4 things. If you're a studio, first of all, you ideally want something that's repeatable. So BioWare uses rock stars, so Dylan, Hendrix, Joplin, Bowie, Morrison. These are a consistent theme. DICE uses the names of different cities for its code names. The reason why you ideally want something that's repeatable like that is so that when other parts of your organization outside of the studio are talking about a game with a code name, they can immediately attribute the code name to your studio. They know that if they hear a city name, it's probably a DICE game. If they hear a Rockstar, it's probably a BioWare game. And this can be useful for just simplifying the conversation that's going on within the larger organization. If you are an independent, it doesn't matter as much. I just think it's a good habit to get into. And before Dylan, BioWare didn't have consistent code names. And if you don't have that consistent pattern, what can actually happen very easily is you don't want to bother to spend the time to narrow the space from all possible words in all possible languages across the entire planet to a single code name. If you've already narrowed the box, then the amount of energy required to pick that code name is greatly reduced. So even for those of you who are independent studios, I'd still recommend having some sort of rubric or pattern or ritual around your code name so that the actual amount of energy required to pick it is greatly reduced. Secondly, you ideally want something that is unusable. We hear lots of stories about code names that end up being the actual name of the project. Xbox, Project Gotham Racing. This happens quite a bit because, as I talked about in my video on names, name plus time equals fine. So people living with a code name for long enough, they get used to it and they start to like it. And it has a high possibility of becoming the name of the product. Now, in the case of sequels, that's not very likely to happen. You're not going to ship Mass Effect Andromeda as Bowie, or you're not going to ship Dragon Age 4 as Joplin or Morrison. This is just not going to happen. But there was a reasonable chance that Anthem could have been shipped as Dylan because it lived with that codename for long enough. It was basically okay. There was always a possibility that it could have shipped. So when you're looking for a codename, ideally you want something that doesn't have a high probability of actually being an acceptable name for the final product. In the case of sequels, that's the reason why you should stay away from things like Mass Effect 5 or Dragon Age 4, because those are completely acceptable project names and they really have a high probability of just becoming your default name. But third point, the name has to be something that people are willing to actually say out loud. You've heard that Dragon Age at one point had the code name of Nug-Storm. The problem with Nug-Storm, definitely unshippable. The problem with it is that people aren't actually willing to say it out loud. So if they aren't willing to say it out loud, then they end up having to apply their own codename, Dragon Age 2. And then you've defeated yourself because now what you've ended up with, rather than this unshippable Nug-Storm as your codename, you've accidentally ended up with Dragon Age 2 as a proxy codename, and you are now having to fight with that problem. Make sure that while you want something that's unshippable, you also want something that people are willing to say out loud. And fourth and finally, as a corollary to willing to say out loud, they have to actually be able to say it out loud. So that means it has to actually be pronounceable. You can't just bang your fist on the keyboard until you get a 7-letter word and call it that, because glurgnurknursknlurk isn't pronounceable, and as a result, people aren't going to be willing to say it out loud, and you're going to end up again with a proxy codename. Okay, let's call that 3A so that I can make this 4. You also need something that isn't too generic. Something like Project 1, Project 2, Project 3 checks all the previous checkboxes. It's pronounceable, it's not silly, it differentiates the project successfully, but because it's so generic, it has no stickiness. So people will end up not using that either. Even if they're playing ball, they'll say something like, I'm working on Project 2. The person they're talking to is like, which one is that again? And then they'll say, oh yeah, that's Dragon Age 4. And you've lost control of the situation again. So like something pronounceable, like something not too silly, you need something that's going to actually be used. Make something that isn't too generic, that actually includes some ability to be sticky in people's minds. So how much effort should you be spending on picking your codename? That's interesting because you can see different approaches to this from different kinds of people. And I would actually argue it lines up pretty closely with the different kind of storyteller. If you are a story crafter, someone like Casey Hudson, you might spend a lot of time thinking about what you want your codename to be, thinking about Bob Dylan and how Bob Dylan influenced music in different way, and then arriving on Dylan as your codename because it evokes for you a lot of things that you want your project to evoke. If you're a storyteller, much more loose, well, that's how you might end up with something like Nug-Storm, where you just come up with something that you think is clever and then you use that and it doesn't really work out. Storyteller, you can sometimes have some difficulty making things that have lasting impact. If you're a story shaper like me, then you might decide, well, we've got this naming criteria of using rock star names. I want a woman, and then Janis Joplin is literally the first one that comes to mind, and you use Joplin for your title. It fits your criteria, and there's a little bit of thought behind it, but not too much more than that. I would argue that probably you want to spend maybe a little bit more time than I did, because you might want to make sure that there's no negative baggage with your choice. But to be honest, name plus time equals fine. So if it fits your rubric, I would argue that it's actually probably okay, because it's going to get used and then it will essentially wash away all other meaning in the process of becoming your codename. Codenames, I think, are actually really important. They are valuable to give your project reality before it is ready to have a real name that is public facing. They allow you the flexibility to figure out what your name actually should be while the game is still in development, but they make something that might feel too ethereal a solidity that it otherwise wouldn't have. Special thanks to my members. They provide the resources that this channel needs to keep running. If you're interested in becoming a member, there will be a link down in the description. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up because that tells YouTube that they should share this with more people and it's worth spreading around. We have merch now. This is the High Tea on the High Seas shirt. We actually have a flag for that as well. There's a shelf below this video to the merch store for this channel. What do you think? What are some code names for shipped projects that you thought were fine? What are some codenames you've heard for things that end up getting a new title after the fact? Anything you can think of that had a cool codename and kind of a boring final name? Let me know these things down in the comments. I will see you again soon. Thank you.